Я з Леніним стояв на барикадах, нас кликав революції гудок. Нескорених окопах Сталінграда вручав мені полковник партквиток. Я з Леніним дорогами крутими добро і правду ніс в чужі світи. У полум'ї народи побратими планету врятували від біди. Я з Леніним в тривозі неспокої кував братерства сонячні мости. По них тепер до радості людської комуністичний світ ідуть брати. На наших портритах вождя портрет і вічно скличе серцем комуністів. Комуністи вперед, комуністи вперед, і стають на подвиг комуністів. Ми з Леніним гарячими руками, як прапор нашу правду підняли, і житиме очі мудрі і ясні, що крізь бурю і негоду бачать сонячну погоду, креслять путь весні. Тайне джерело, що немов живлющу воду нам дало навік свободу, світло і тепло. Розум ясен світ, покоряє він природу, світ землі, гул заводу, праці його плід. Це мужня сім'я героїчна, борців за свободу і мир. Це партія комуністична,
Вперед, брати, до світлої мети. Для нас комуни день, для нас вінки пісень.
Подумає всі славати, сила молода. Тут вперед бригади комуністичного труда.
Новім співах ми будем жить у щасті дивних літ, і світ творить комуністичний світ. світлої мети. для нас помилуй день, для нас вінки пісень.
Радісне майбутнє в праці здобувай, сильний і могутній наш радянський край.
Сьогодні ми не на параді, до комунізму на путі, комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті, комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті.
Любо працювати, важко не біда, нам як справжнє свято, кожен день труда.
Сьогодні ми не на параді, до комунізму на путі, комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті, комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті.
В нас ясна дорога, слово в нас тверде, ми життя нового починаєм день.
Сьогодні ми не на параді, до комунізму на путі, комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті. Радісне майбутнє праці здобувай, молодий могутній наш радянський край.
Сьогодні ми не на параді, до комунізму на путі, комуністичній ми бригаді, нам Ленін у житті.
Комуністичній ми бригаді, з нами Ленін у житті. Так пішли на війну громадянську, тут нема
Hello and welcome. It's Saturday Q&A show, and I requested questions and comments from you, and you, the audience, have provided. So we're going to be getting to those in just a little moment or two. And first of all, though, I'm going to be talking about a couple of issues related to both the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is, of course, our main subject for a lot of these streams, but also a few domestic developments with regard to Britain, and of course the ongoing, shall we say, chicanery going on within the trade union movement and various other things that I've been talking about recently that have come to a head, both with the Unite conference, which has of course bound itself hand and foot again to the Labour Party, and the various, quite frankly, capitulations that have been carried out by the Communication Workers Union, the teaching unions, and most probably coming up the health unions as well, I would imagine, coming very soon. So more on that in just a moment. I'm just going to make sure we've properly advertised everything here. Good morning to Peter, Jerry, and Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. How you doing? So we'll start off with the discussion of this trade union failure in Britain, and this comes, unsurprisingly, on the heels of, as I said, the Unite conference overwhelmingly voting to recommit themselves to being tied to the Labour Party for another few years, but also the steady implosion of the industrial action that was building last year and in the early part of this year. Now, in the last week, you've seen the Communication Workers Union agree to, by a vote of their members by 75% or so, to the, quite frankly, terrible deal that was put to them by the Royal Mail management. And it's a testament to the fact that the trade union movement faces, quite frankly, a very, very profound crisis. For instance, the CWU, Communication Workers Union, and this is a dispute involving the postal service in Britain. Hello to others who've just dropped in. We've got hello to Terry, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project, and hello to Roddy from the West Midlands, a place I spent many years in when I was at university. So it has its charms, let me say, including more canals than Venice, according to the Birmingham Tourist Board. So back to this CWU deal, first of all. What they've agreed to is a 3-year pay deal, which is a 10% increase across 3 years. So like 3.33% per year, essentially. At a time when, at this, even according to the government's own measurement of the current rate of inflation, it's running at around 8%. Now that's probably undercounting it. And bear in mind, we've had stagnating wages in Britain for, in many cases, at least a decade, though you could make the argument that the overall wage rise in Britain has not actually outstripped the rate of inflation since the early 1980s. So in both Britain and, of course, the United States as well, actual wage increases have been essentially stagnant for 40 years. So you combine that with the fact that there's been downward pressure on wages relentlessly since 2008. You've got staffing crises, especially in the public sector. You've got the deleterious effects of privatization on Royal Mail as a service. And you've got a real, basically, shit deal that's been given to the Royal Mail workforce and recommended by their union leaders. Now, as I said when I last commented on this, and it's not surprising when both the union leaders and the employers unite behind something. You've got to have a very strong trade union rank and file movement to be able to turn that back, to turn that around. And currently that whilst there was a decent job done by the rank and file organisers in CWU to fight back against this, they weren't strong enough to turn it around and beat the union's own recommendation. So that's now, that dispute is over. There's going to be a tremendous amount of demoralisation within the union, within the rank and file, that their leadership essentially led them up to the top of the hill last year with all these ballots that were very strongly supported. The CWU rank and file organisers did a hell of a good job turning out the vote to get over the very high postal ballot threshold that you have to get through thanks to the anti-union laws in Britain. They passed that by miles. The mood was clearly there to actually fight amongst the membership of the CWU, but the CWU leaders ran a mile when it came down to it, because what they were faced with, and this is the same with regard to the leaders of the education unions, and it's going to be the same with regard to the leaders of the health unions, is that the government, which is the key player behind all of these disputes, it doesn't matter that Royal Mail is a privatised service, essentially the government has to underwrite it for that privatisation to be carried off. Remember what I said the other day on the stream when talking about the CWU dispute. When it comes to Royal Mail, the government had to retain the pension obligations just to make the private sector want to bid for it. And this is the big lie of a lot of privatisation in Britain, and it will be the same elsewhere, which is when it's an essential service like the postal service or the trains or the water companies in Britain or electricity or anything related to energy, the private companies just take the profit, but of course the government has to underwrite it all, which is just shows how much of a fraud and a scam this always was. It was always just about transferring profits and keeping the liabilities nationalised, which has always been the case, and it will be the case with Royal Mail as well. So the effect of this on the whole workforce of the Royal Mail, the CWU leaders selling out, as I said, is going to be pretty devastating. A lot of talk of people leaving the union, a lot of talk of people just falling out of activity into demoralisation, which I think is a mistake. And the same will be true in teachers' unions as well, who've like whipped up their members to this struggle, and they've agreed to a 6% deal with the government, which is in line with what the supposedly independent pay review body recommended. But of course, these pay review bodies are just bureaucratic entities set up by the government to make it look as if it's some independent, neutral recommendation that's being put forward here. It's not. It's a bunch of government bureaucrats and bourgeois hired intellectuals coming together to look as if they're an independent body. They're actually not. They're putting forward a recommendation that the government is going to be okay with. That's what pay review bodies do. So this, as of course, the capitulation of the CWU, the rapid surrender of the education unions, and has given the government a huge boost in terms of its propaganda against the health unions, and the BMA in particular, the doctors' union, who've been out on strike in the last week. They are now under relentless pressure to cave in. Sunak's saying it. All, of course, the press that is aligned with the Conservative Party is saying it. This is going to be relentless, and my prediction is that the BMA will give up for whatever shit deal is put on the table by the government, because it's a tremendously difficult thing to ask health service workers to go on strike, because of course it's a profession which is based on caring for patients, and the overwhelming majority of both doctors and nurses and other health professionals won't want to go on strike, and their strike is by necessity limited. So it is always going to be a difficult sell. And it says a lot about how badly the health professions have been kicked around, that they have got such strong showing in their ballots for industrial action. But fundamentally, the health service, if it is going to be saved, if it is going to be saved from the devastation of privatization, which they're not doing openly, they're trying to do in a hidden fashion, has to be supported by the other elements of the trade union movement. Because the health service, a service which is, of course, free to access, free at the point of delivery, so to speak, it's the point of it is that it is overwhelmingly a benefit for the working class. And so it must be the working class that comes together through industrial action to actually defend it. Voting Labour isn't defending the National Health Service, because the Labour Party spent 13 years in office privatising it, though, as I said in the other day when I was talking about my interview I did on the podcast with Dr. Bob Gill, a long-time campaigner against NHS privatisation, he said on that interview that the health service union leaders basically agreed to shut up about privatisation in return for a few miserly concessions from the previous Labour government. So they've already essentially cut their own members' knees off on many different occasions. So what was actually needed to not only defend the terms and conditions of staff in the National Health Service, but to defend the service as something which is beneficial to the working class because you can access it for free. It's not going down the road of the American system openly just yet, though of course they are trying to push it in that direction. If you want to defend that, then you have to pull out as many industrial sectors of the economy as possible and essentially put a gun to the head of the government to say, stop what you're doing, settle this dispute on favourable terms, or the entire economy gets disrupted and there will be devastating consequences politically for you. That's the only way you're going to be able to adequately defend this. The nurses, doctors and other medical staff should not be put in a position where they have to go on strike. The rest of us should have to do it. And the entire society would have to do it. And I think there would be a mood to do that if it was built for properly. But of course, none of the unions is going to do that. None of the union leaders are going to do that because they're all desperate to keep their respectable place essentially within the British state structure. They're all desperate not to get prosecuted under the anti-union laws. And they're all desperate really to defend the bureaucracies they all come from, not to defend their members, not to defend the wider working class. And none of them have a conception of the wider working class at all. It's ridiculously sectional in that respect, but sectional in a way that's not even good for the members of the unions that are represented here. So, for instance, what good does tying Unite to the Labour Party do any of its members in the extensive private sector membership they've got or the public sector membership they've got? None whatsoever. None whatsoever. And so when it comes to the leadership as a whole, it is a question of a crisis of leadership within the working class, in that you have these ridiculous characters leading the trade unions at the moment who talk a big game but deliver absolutely nothing. It is a case of the fact that left trade union leaders talk a big game and get elected, but to actually hold them to account, to actually hold them accountable for any of the words that they say, any of the commitments that they make, takes a level of rank and file organization that we haven't seen in this country for at least, well, over 40 years now, so as long as I've been alive. So to actually get to the point where the union leaders are afraid enough of their own rank and file that they're prepared to actually go further in going against the government and the employers will take the mass participation of trade union members in the structures of their union and also being prepared to go around the structures of their union. Remember, it wasn't actually the National Union of Mine Workers leaders that called the 1984 to 85 strike or indeed started the 1972 strike in the coal industry in this country. It was the organised workers themselves within the mining industry. And in Scotland, they actually stormed their own Scottish NUM regional headquarters and demanded that the union leaders call a strike. It was the men who were under threat of the sack at places like Corton Wood, an old coal field in Yorkshire, who walked out and demanded the union leaders back them. It's that kind of organisation within the working class that actually can win strikes. Again, as Marx himself makes clear as early as the 1850s, winning a strike and then managing to hang on to the benefits of the win is a very difficult job. But to get even close to doing it, that's the kind of organisation that you need. Simply electing the most left-wing man or woman who turns up with a good line in bullshit doesn't do the job, because Dave Ward in the CWU, Sharon Graham of Unite, and the old union I used to be a part of, PCS, led by Mark Sawatka, the supposed big-time left-winger, none of these elected officials are going to be enough on their own, no matter how big a game they talk, without that level of organization at the base of the union that is not only prepared to push them into action, but is prepared to go around them if they won't do it, if the bureaucracy gets in the way. And so what we have now is a mess. What we have is all these union leaders who get elected saying, I will do this, that, and the other, but doing nothing and demoralizing the membership, and then loads of people drop out of activity, loads of people just fall into political despair or nihilism. Well, we can't have that. So again, this is why me and several other comrades started the Class Consciousness Project. What we need to learn from and what we need to get back towards is examples like the old National Minority Movement, a rank and file trade union organization that was run largely by the old Communist Party when it was still worthy of the name in the 20s and early 30s, which organized workers across many different trade unions to push for a more militant position, to organize within the rank and file of those unions, to push the officialdom into doing something decent. And the trade union officialdom hated the National Minority Movement with a passion, as did the leaders of the Labour Party. And they hated the rank and file movements of the 70s and into the early 80s, because it, of course, pushed them into confrontations with the state and the employers that they didn't want to have. No trade union leader from the earliest stages in the British trade union movement, all the way back in like the 1860s, when the organization that's now known as the TUC started to be formed, they've always been, again, Marx observes this in the 1860s because he worked with all of these characters, they've always been these sectional, small c conservative, overly bureaucratic characters that come from craft unions a lot of the time, have a craft union mentality, have a very sectional mentality, have a very reactionary set of politics. That's always been what the leadership of the British trade union movement is like. The difference is that the employers and the government from the 80s onwards managed to stamp out the rank and file movements within the unions and managed to essentially hurl back a rising tide of class consciousness that was building in the 70s. And we need to learn that lesson. And if we don't, then it's just going to be more and more defeats. There's going to be more and more defeats, a periodic election of some left-winger who people think is going to change things, but on their own, they're not going to change jack shit. Again, the other key component here is the shackling of the movement to the Labour Party. And as I've said before, this is something that the state and the employers very much welcome, because this is another layer of governmental and state pressure that can be applied to the upper ranks of the trade union leadership. And this is the thing that we need to realize. As long as the union movement in Britain, or you could say the same in the United States, with regard to how the AFL-CIO is basically tied to the Democrats, bound to it hand and foot. And you could say the same in many other countries where the union federations are bound to the rotting and decaying social democratic parties. The social democratic parties now are reformists without reforms. All they offer is like a slightly repainted version of the same cutbacks, privatization and wage restraint that comes with the Tories or the American Republican Party or Emmanuel Macron in France or the traffic light coalition in Germany. They offer nothing. And so the pressure that then goes down from them onto the union leaders is also to do nothing. And so when you've got that combination of pressure from the state, the employers, the party that they're affiliated to, and no corresponding pressure coming from the ranks of the unions, then it's no wonder the leaders are crap. It's no wonder that they all automatically surrender, because the whole history of class struggle in all of the advanced capitalist nations shows us that it only succeeds when the working class has a higher level of consciousness and thus a higher level of organization, that it can shove the union leaders in the right direction or shove them out of the way if need be. And until we get to that point, until we have that realization that that is what we need to do, and we are going to keep losing. I've lost every single industrial dispute I've ever been a part of, and I was part of quite a few over the last 10 years. And they were all sold out, not for the lack of determination or anger from the workers involved, they were all sold out by a calculated capitulation from the top, because we didn't have the necessary level of organization within most of the unions to basically either bolster the courage of those union leaders or put them in a position of having a great fear of losing their privileged position, losing their bureaucratic positions, because the workers had turfed them out. And until we manage to create unions that are more properly democratic, that don't have these vast layers of bureaucracy which are filled with people who are unelected, who are very well paid, and who are completely divorced from class struggle, then we're going to struggle, because that is the way that we've got to move forward now. We've got to push for unions that are truly accountable, which means we've got to get rid of this bureaucratic layer that sits in every regional office of every major trade union, doing nothing except covering its own arses and absorbing large amounts of money, because all these people are on far more than you would find in the union they're supposed to be representing. And so we've got to push for fully democratized structures. We've got to push for a carving back, shall we say, a paring back of the grotesque salaries that a lot of these people are on, to make sure that they're kept in touch with the people that they're meant to actually be leading. And we've got to get the union movement away from being tied to the Labour Party, because in every major union, Unite, GMB and Unison, there's all these characters in the bureaucracies whose jobs are linked to the Labour Party, who want to use it as a career progression path to get on in the Labour Party. Either get to be a councillor, then you get to be on the never-ending expenses gravy train, and usually if you're a councillor in a place like Manchester, where I'm speaking to you from now, or Liverpool, or Sheffield, or Birmingham, or London, the major urban centres are all dominated by the Labour Party. If you get to be a councillor in one of these big urban centres, even though like the actual remuneration for being a councillor is not big, but you get a lot of expenses. You get taken to a lot of corporate dinners by developers who want you to sign on to some dodgy deal involving a new property development. You look at the expenses of the council leaders in a place like Manchester, and you can see it's like a never-ending roll call of like all the like business organisations in the northwest, or in any region that you're in, want to put the leading councillors on their boards, have them go to endless meetings, have them taken on free trips to the Middle East, to anywhere else that's like a big capitalist development. And of course, this is just a way to exercise legal corruption. And your way into that life of perpetual security and legal corruption is often through the bureaucracy of the trade union movement. So the whole thing needs to be pulled down. The whole edifice of the labour bureaucracy, so the bureaucracy within the unions and it being tied to the Labour Party bureaucracy, all of that needs to be ripped down one way or another. It's one of the crucial things blocking the development of class struggle and the furthering of class consciousness within the working class in Britain today, is that huge bureaucratic barrier. And that is what we need to pull down. And I think that most working class people, if having this outlined to them, even if they're not that politically educated right now, they'll understand that. They know very well that the unions are shit. They know very well that the leaders will sell them out, and they know the Labour Party's shit as well. The people who are the problem here aren't the working class, it's the intermediate layers, the corrupted end of the class that's gone into the bureaucracy, the institutional left in Britain, which is tied to the union and the Labour Party bureaucracy. It's those people that we've got to shove out of the way. In the words of Lenin, when he was speaking about the collapse of the Second International and the need to reform the communist movement, we need to go beyond these people into the deep masses. And in the British case, that's the millions of working class people who, they might be union members, but they've never been active in the unions. They probably do go on strike, but they're not involved with it. They don't really know how their unions work a lot of the time, and that's deliberately kept from them by the trade union bureaucrats. And we need to reach those people and the millions more who aren't in any union at all and have never been in one, might not even really know what one is. But it's those elements of the working class that we need to get to and that we need to organise amongst. not what the left does, which is endlessly competing for influence within the bureaucratic structures of the union movement. So that's where we need to go. And until we start going in that direction, some of us are trying to move in that direction. Again, be sure to look at the analysis of the Class Consciousness Project on this particular question. But again, until we do, we're going to be stuck on this treadmill of defeat. And that's not somewhere I particularly want to be. So, let's just go back into the chat. Hello from Warren and Michelle in Tasmania. All the way from Tasmania. Hello there. Gillian in Bucharest. Hello. Paddy in Ireland. How you doing? Hello to Jay over in Norfolk, Virginia. HM. Hello to you in Brighton. Jerry says, these percentages, when they're a percentage of such a low wage, amount to so little. Very true. Terry, comrade from the Class Consciousness Project, says, I'm encouraging my comrades in the CWU to stay in the union but become more active in the grassroots. These leaders have forgotten their roots and they've sold their soul for an ermine cloak. And the reference to an ermine cloak is a very apt one there because, of course, the many of the trade union leaders, even the big-time left-wingers, they often end up in our deeply corrupt upper chamber of Parliament known as the House of Lords. And they get that, which is, again, is another corrupt little gig that you can get hold of. It's over £300 a day expenses, and if you can retire there, you can have basically a subsidised piss-up every day and fall asleep on the red benches. And that's where a lot of trade union leaders end up. They end up as barons, earls, lords, or those who have performed lesser services for the state end up as a knight of the realm. And again, the British state doesn't hand out these awards like confetti. They hand them out for you doing the British ruling class services. And the services provided by the union leaders are to act as responsible union leaders. And that means stifling struggle, making sure that it remains contained within acceptable parameters, and making sure that militancy in the unions doesn't go too far. That's the job of trade union leaders. And it's certainly what they're rewarded for. So, hello to Steve Sweeney. Very interesting interview I did with Steve on the war in Ukraine and everything related to that. He's reporting from the Donetsk People's Republic at the moment. That interview is up on Patreon already, and it'll go out in 2 parts on the regular podcast service, starting from today. Irish Partisan says, I was a member of SIP2 in my previous job in Dublin, and my impression was of a union ensconced in its bureaucracy with its management completely aloof from many of its members. Yep, and that's not just Ireland, Irish Partisan, that's everywhere. That goes for all of the TUC unions. All completely bureaucratic entities, more concerned with feathering their own nest and covering their own arses than they are with actually representing workers. And again, this is one of the most vital thing that we have to change. Hello to Kai over in the northeastern United States, I believe. Ash, good evening to you in Melbourne. Peter says, I listened to your interview with Dr. Bob Gill. It beggars belief that any rank and file trade unions can imagine that the Labour Party will do anything but serve City of London and BlackRock diktats. And they'll do it openly. Irish Partisan says, my union, SIP2, just took my monthly contribution from my salary and gave a cut to the Irish Labour Party. Same here, with all the unions other than a minority who aren't affiliated to the Labour Party. Paddy says, whatever about the British Labour Party taking union money, at least the British unions can argue that UK Labour will have power at some point. The Irish Labour Party has zero chance of wielding power. Well, yes, that's true. It's still an appalling deal, though. The argument that they can make in British terms, that the bureaucrats and the Labour-affiliated unions will make, is that, oh, well, the worst Labour government's better than a Tory government. That's categorically untrue. The Labour government from 1997 to 2010 did things that the Tories couldn't dream of doing, including like dressing up things like the minimum wage as a good deal when it wasn't. The minimum wage, by the way, is always a joke because the minimum wage is what the capitalist is prepared to pay you anyway, because what the capitalist has to pay you is enough for you to keep standing on your feet and doing the job, and of course reproduce yourself, i.e. bring about the creation of the next generation of workers, and that's about it. So minimum wage legislation, when it was brought in Britain, like barely changed the actual wage structure. It provided like a floor under which you're not supposed to fall, but of course it then enabled the employers to say, well, we pay the minimum wage. It's like, yeah, you would have paid the minimum wage anyway. It does nothing other than, and of course it had to be subsidized in many areas by the introduction of tax credits by the British government that still run to this day, and this is over 20 years later, because some areas of the economy, particularly like in retail, the pay there is so low that if you're not working, particularly if you're not working full time, you can't live off those wages. So the government has to step in and subsidize it to at least the tune of 11 billion a year, probably more now. So again, this is all like a reactionary joke. Everything that the Labour Party did between 1997 and 2010, the very, very tiny amounts that they did that benefited the working class quickly got undone in 2008. And then what was left, the Tories shredded, and the Labour Party isn't going to bring it back. So everything that they said that they were going to do for all the working class was either a lie or at the very least a double-edged sword. So the union's argument about, oh, well, you know, the worst Labour government's better than the Tory government, this isn't opposition. This is a partnership between the Labour Party and the Tories, as it is in the United States between the Democrats and the Republicans. Both act in service to capital and both act to stiff the working class whenever they possibly can. One just does it with the rhetoric of family, flag and free market. The other one will do it while telling you they've got empathy for you. I don't know which is worse. I think that the left version of that is worse because it's more deceptive. So, moving on. Yes, Irish Partisan, I will get to your question in just a moment, because that's our look at trade union awfulness in Britain concluded. There is one other point that I wanted to get to with regard to the Biden executive order about troops being deployed to, the European theatre. Now, I'll just call up the text of the executive order here because this has produced a lot of excitement. So, Biden probably didn't sign this himself, by the way. This is something that his office will have just generated in response to a request from the Pentagon. By the authority vested in me as President, by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, including Sections 121 and 12304 of Title 10 United States Code, I hereby determine that it is necessary to augment the active armed forces of the United States for the effective conduct of Operation Atlantic Resolve. Why do they always come up with these stupid titles? In and around the United States European Command's area of responsibility. In furtherance of this operation under the stated command and stated authority, I hereby authorize the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security with respect to the Coast Guard when it is not operating as a service in the Navy under the respective jurisdictions to order to active duty any units and any individual members not assigned to a unit organized to serve as a unit of the selected reserve or any member in the individual ready reserve mobilization category and designated as essential under regulations prescribed by the Secretary concerned not to exceed 3,000 total members at any one time, of whom not more than 450 may be members of the individual ready reserve as they deem necessary, and to terminate the service of those units and members ordered to active duty. So, what, pray tell, does any of that actually mean? In essence, what it actually means is, and this point goes to something that Irish Partisan is asking about, what it essentially means is that the US is calling up people because it's got a severe skills gap in its European forces. And this is something that a Politico article came out about, stating that they've got like problems in admin and technical support within the European services that they've got. Bear in mind, they've deployed an extended number of troops to Poland, and they've had them there for over 18 months now, beyond the usual requirements that they had for their European forces. Now, bear in mind also, as I've said many times before, US actual military strength isn't what you think it is. Like, yes, they have a significantly large army. It is, of course, the largest and most powerful force in NATO, with the Turks coming in as second, but it's spread out all over the world. To actually rustle up something that could do any kind of serious intervention in Ukraine, they would need to strip out all of their military presence from all the way across the world, including in Southeast Asia, which they're not going to want to do. So these 3,000 that are going in, these are most likely going to be people, it's a targeted call-up of reservists who have specific skills which the forces in Europe are lacking. So according to the Politico article I read about it, it was about technical specialists, people who are specialists in communication, mechanics, and also admin and support people. Because to keep that amount of men, 40-odd thousand in Poland, it takes a lot of specialists to actually make sure that that force functions. And also they'll need men to carry out repair work on damaged American vehicles that have been blown up or severely crippled in Ukraine and brought back to Poland to be repaired again. So I don't think this is anything other than a showing not of that the Americans are getting ready to do something, but that their forces in Europe can't be sustained without doing a call up into their reserves. Bear in mind that the US has had a chronic recruitment crisis facing its armed services for almost 20 years now. There was a burst of recruitment activity after September the 11th, 2001, and that was one of the big things they used that for as propaganda. But since things turned nasty in Iraq and the military started incurring significant casualties there, the recruitment levels just dropped off the cliff. And they kept having to lower the bar to recruitment. So they were recruiting people with a string of criminal convictions, with drug problems, people who were like completely out of physical shape, who couldn't pass the physical tests. They were dropping the barriers to that. And they were still facing problems recruiting and retaining people. So the fact that they're having to dip into their reserve pool to do a targeted call-up of various specialists just says that they're not in a position to do anything significant. As to this idea that it's some sort of tripwire, no, I don't think that at all. I mean, there's a reference to the small number of troops they have in northern Syria. That's a completely different situation. Those are there essentially with the tacit agreement of the Russian government, even though it's a rather uneasy agreement. They've been there for a number of years. If they were to try and do the same thing in a place like Odessa, that would be tantamount to declaring that it's wartime. And again, Biden's not going to do that. I know, as Irish Partisan points out, that they're prepping for a possible ground war against Russia, and RFK Jr. said that. Well, RFK Jr. is talking shit, to be quite honest and blunt about it. The NATO summit this week that just gone shows us what the US is actually capable of and what it's not. Bear in mind what I said. The Russians have made it clear that any entry of forces into Ukraine that is not agreed with them will be considered to be an act of war. And they, for all the talk and all the bullshit that comes out of the NATO countries, they are afraid of the Russian armed forces. They are, because the people who actually do intelligence gathering in military intelligence and the civilian intelligence forces and the senior military men who have half a clue, and some of those do exist in the European armies and in the United States as well, they know very well that the Russians are getting up towards having 1 million men that they could deploy in Ukraine, many of which are surrounding the northern and eastern sections of the battlefield that are still in Russia and Belarus. And they're recruiting 1,400 men a day, apparently. Now, let's assume that out of those, a third are unfit for service. That's still around about 1,000 a day. So they can make, in terms of recruitment, what the Americans just called up inside less than a week. So the military professionals who have any amount of brain power know that they're outnumbered, that they are outgunned, that they are unable to cope with Russian air defense, that they don't have sufficient air forces themselves to even adequately battle the Russian Air Force, and that they can't get into the Black Sea unless the Turks suddenly flip and let them in. Always possible with Erdogan, you never know what he's going to do. But the overwhelming military advantage is with the Russians. So all this gibberish that they talk about, oh, the Russians can't fight, they're having to press gang men, the Russians are surrendering, they're running away. All of that is what a psychologist might call a projection, because that's what's happening with the Ukrainians. It's the Ukrainian forces that are having to press gang men into service. It's the Ukrainian forces that are now increasingly getting to the front line and finding ways to surrender. And again, NATO cannot deploy forces into Ukraine without an agreement that is to be had with the Russians. And at the moment, no such agreement exists, nor is it likely to. There may be, and as I've said on the last stream I did on this, that it may be that we end up with a tacit agreement about dividing the country and leaving a rump of Ukraine in place. But I don't think we're going to get anything like that, like a sort of sit down at the table moment where everybody agrees on a new settlement. What we're going to get is a tacit understanding and in the end a frozen conflict and a rump Ukraine left in place. Now what that rump Ukraine looks like is still something of an open question. And again, we've got a question on this in the specific Q&A. So no, I don't think it's going to be wartime. I think RFK Jr. is electioneering on that. Anybody serious who looks at this thinks that even the Biden administration and Sunak and people like that are cynical, horrendous characters, but they're not so stupid as to dive into a war with the Russians. Let's have a look at further comments. Roddy, the class collaboration of the teaching unions was evident when they issued a joint statement with the government to sell their sellout to its members. Exactly correct. Whenever they start issuing joint statements with the employers, you know it's a joint statement designed to stiff the workers involved in any dispute. Ash asks, have you read Chip Wars by Chris Miller? If not, do you think the US attempting to prevent China from building their semiconductor industry seems to not have worked? Yeah, they're essentially 20 years too late. I haven't read the book, Chip Wars. I know it's been recommended, so it's on my list. But if they wanted to prevent the Chinese building up their own high-tech industries, including the production of semiconductors, well, then they should have thought more clearly before all those US and European corporations signed those deals with the Chinese government that allowed the Chinese to have access to essentially how to construct these things, to learn the secrets, so to speak, and then were able to build up their own industry. The Chinese have got contingency plans in place and are not being affected by this attempt at all. What will be effective in terms of the US's war on China is, of course, their war on Taiwan, the US war on Taiwan, because the US is attempting to essentially scalp the Taiwanese chip industry and to export it lock, stock and barrel to the United States. That's what's going on right now. It's what they did earlier on, 30 years ago, to the Japanese with regard to their microprocessor industry back in the late 80s and early 90s. So the Americans are looking to reindustrialize, and the only way that, of course, the US ruling class can think to do this is to destroy industries in their so-called allied countries and to take them back to the United States. So their attempt to stymie Chinese technological development is not going to work. If anything, it seems to be stimulating further growth in the Made in China movement, I think it's called, that Xi Jinping has unveiled. And it's prompting the Chinese leadership to carry out more development of their own technological base, and of course to make sure that this is self-sustaining within China, or that they can at least get the components from allied countries, and to remove or reduce their exposure to the rather tempestuous and unpredictable moods within the United States. So this is 20 years too late by American imperialism, thankfully so as well. So Irish Partisan asks, do you think the grain deal will go through? Dima from Military Summary Channel says no, and that we will see increased activity in the Russian Navy from the Northwest Black Sea after the 17th of July. Well, I'm hearing very contradictory things about that, to answer Irish Partisan's point. On the one hand, I heard that Erdogan is desperate for the grain deal to go ahead. He may have he may have pissed on his own chips by doing that deal with the Ukrainian regime, because even though I don't think that letting those Azov criminals go does Ukraine or the Azov scumbags themselves any favors, they'll all end up dying on the battlefield. But they, it may be the case that the Turks really want the grain deal to continue, certainly because they're benefiting a lot out of it. If it's the case that the Russians are moving on to, well, looking at offensive operations soon, and they're going to get more active in the Black Sea, then I think the grain deal is going to go down in flames. Also, it's politically unpopular in Russia itself, and that's a factor that Putin has to take into consideration when making this decision. So it may well be that he turns around to Erdogan and says, look, we're going to continue the development of having Turkey be an energy hub, but this grain deal essentially is a political non-starter now, because not only have the Europeans failed to live up to any of the promises they made with regard to Russian agricultural exports being essentially facilitated again, but also, again, it's become very unpopular in Russia itself. So we're already getting stories coming out that the Ukrainians have now used the grain deal agreement to remilitarize Snake Island. So again, that's something that the Russians are not going to be happy with. They've used the grain deal corridors, the shipping corridors, to repeatedly carry out military activity. So I can't see why the Russians would go ahead with it unless it was to try and get something out of Erdogan. And again, I think personally it's probably going to end. And basically Erdogan will be told, look, you've made your choice, we're making ours. You can throw all your toys out of the pram and wreck the other deals we've got going with you at the same time, or you can basically accept that we're now acting in our interest as you are acting in yours. And I heard that one of the reasons why Erdogan agreed to all Biden's demands over Ukraine and over Swedish entry into NATO was to try and get a line of credit from the International Monetary Fund, because he's in deep shit, economically speaking. And the Turkish economy is in a hole. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to get out of it. So he essentially ran to Biden as his banker and made all those concessions. So I think that the grain deal will end. And yeah, I think it'll be in anticipation of greater military activity by the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. And Erdogan will have to suck it up, basically. Are the US using Russia to deliberately destroy as much of Ukraine as possible to saddle with Russia with a draining rebuild then when they take control? That's part of it, HM, to answer your question. The tactics that are going to be used now by the American imperialists in Ukraine are going to be scorched earth tactics. I've said this before. It's going to be basically they are going to just spin this war out as long as they possibly can now, to cost the Russians as much as possible, to damage as much of Ukraine as possible, and to land the Russians with as big a bill as possible, and as damaged a society as possible when they are forced to take over as much of Ukraine as possible. That's the fallback option. That's what they ultimately want. They want to, as Lindsey Graham pointed out in a bizarrely honest tweet recently, that scumbag, an ally of Trump, by the way, he pointed out that, well, we want to kill as many Russians as possible at as lower cost to the US as possible. And that's the tactic they're going to follow. They're going to essentially, as long as they can keep the Ukrainian state propped up and Zelensky in play, they'll keep this war going at great cost and horrific cost to the Ukrainians, and they'll force the Russians to advance further and further into Ukraine and to create as many problems for them as possible in the aftermath of it. Now, that will last as long as the Ukrainian state can be propped up. So ultimately, this raises a question for the government of the Russian Federation, which is, do they take some kind of action to collapse the Ukrainian state? At the moment, they're keeping their cards close to their chest on that. Medvedev periodically says things that indicates they're thinking of that. And they've got to be aware of what the US plan is here, which is to scorch earth Ukraine, destroy as much of it as possible, and leave them with a giant bill when they have to come and occupy it, because otherwise anything they leave behind is going to turn into a nest of military subversion, terrorist activities that will be conducted against the Russian Federation. So that's the US aim now. Again, think of the most cynical, brutal, and cowardly thing you possibly can, and that will be the US policy. Again, Lindsey Graham is being quite open about it now. So, Roddy says, joint statements with the bosses remind me of George Carlin's observation that when US politicians talk about a bipartisan agreement, it means you're going to get screwed over twice as hard. Exactly right. Irish Partisan says, the GDR collaborated with the Japanese, especially Toshiba and Hitachi in the 80s, in relation to microchip technology. Hence the Americans torpedoing and sinking the Japanese microchip industry. Now that's something I didn't know, Irish Partisan. I'd love to read more about that. Roddy says, I have a feeling Russian wish to move towards Odessa could end the grain deal. You may well be right. The Irish Partisan says the GDR's microchip industry had actually been going on since the 60s and was actually at an advanced stage before 89. Another thing to revisit in the future live streams will be the counter-revolutions of 1989 to 91 and the deeper stories behind them. So keep an eye out for those. Steve Sweeney says, last weekend the Stop the War Coalition in Britain organised a national day of action around the slogan Russian troops out, which can only mean from the Donbass, where they are currently the only line. Well, I think I know how he's going to end that. Steve's referring to there is the alleged Communist Party of Britain, which is the leftover bit of the old Communist Party of Great Britain, which was the original Communist Party, which was a serious organisation at one stage. It collapsed in 1989 under the devastating influence of Euro-communism, which is essentially, as Enver Hoxha pointed out, it's just social democracy. And what it is now is a remnant of that, which is rooted in the trade union bureaucracy. So what Steve's referring to there is that the trade union bureaucracy is wholly in line with the British ruling class when it comes to the policies the British ruling class pursues against Russia. And they have been since the start. There's the anti-Russian sentiment within the trade union bureaucracy, of course, is a reflection of the fact that trade union bureaucracy is not something which is connected to the working class anymore. It's barely connected to it. It is essentially a middle layer which is between the workers and the management and between the workers and the bourgeoisie. And given that, as I said earlier, the pressure from the working class is not enough on the trade union bureaucracy, therefore all of the influences it has bearing down upon it come from the ruling class. And so this anti-Russian shit that the GMB union, that the Unite union and many of the others have been engaged in, and my former union PCS, which is heavily influenced now by the AWL, or the Alliance of White Liberals, or the CIA in drag, is another good name for them. They are a bunch of hideous Trotskyites who are like openly pro-imperialist. That's who are influencing the trade union bureaucracies now. It's principally that they are influenced heavily by bourgeois ideology. And the bourgeois ideology of the British ruling class is, of course, imperialism. And so they are reflecting this ideology within their statements and their policies on the NATO war in Ukraine. And so it's a completely pro-imperialist position. And the Communist Party of Britain exists only within the trade union bureaucracy. It barely has any representation outside of it. And it exists by the whim of the union bureaucracy, because without the unions subscribing to the daily paper called the Morning Star, without them essentially having a number of members within the CPB who probably pay quite big subscriptions into its bank balance, the CPB would not exist. And so when you get this mealy-mouthed or like pro-imperialist nonsense dressed up as pacifism, which is what the Stop the War Coalition, which is primarily influenced by the CPB and the Trotskyites, are doing, what you're seeing is the influence of the bourgeoisie within the trade union movement, within the trade union bureaucracy, and the fact that these Khrushchevite revisionist organizations, which is what the CPB is, and the Trotskyite organizations are all rooted in the trade union bureaucracy and the institutional left, and so they are also repositories of bourgeois ideology. There's no proletarian influence coming into any of these organizations. They are a reflection of the union bureaucracy, which is a reflection of bourgeois ideology, because that's the only pressure they have bearing down upon them. And that's why they're so wretched. Both here and in the United States, it is a case that the lack of proletarian organization and the lack of militancy is what essentially leaves the union leadership to be solely influenced by the ruling class. So, yes, Gillian, I've got your question. I'm going to come to it in just a moment. So, I'm going to move now to the Q&As that are submitted on Patreon and one on Telegram. And I'm going to work through these one by one and then take questions at the end. Further questions at the end. So, first one comes from Walter J. Gunn on Patreon, who I believe is with us on the stream. Asks the following question. Given that Zelensky's military advice and assessments to Zelensky are generally dismissed, is there a possibility that Zelensky would resign or defect to Russia? What will become of Zelensky as the Ukrainian government collapses? Is he the one who will oversee or superintend a rump government once a Russian victory is secured? Is there a possibility that he might lead a military coup that leads to a conditional surrender to the Russians? Well, these are interesting questions, and also I would say that Zelensky is somebody who has been influenced by Russian military thinking. He said in interviews before the beginning of the special military operation last year that one of his primary military intellectual influences is Valery Gerasimov, who is the commander-in-chief of, he's the chief of the Russian armed forces, chief of the Russian general staff, who is regarded as a very good military intellectual, a man who's come up with an awful lot of theories. So he's been very influenced by them. He obviously has contacts with the Russian military. And if you recall the speech by Vladimir Putin when he launched the special military operation in February of last year, he made an appeal to the Ukrainian general staff. And this appeal was for them to do exactly what Jay is suggesting in his question there, which is to lead a military coup against Zelensky. Putin specifically said that we respect the Ukrainian general staff as military professionals, and if you essentially get rid of Zelensky and the Maidan regime and take over the country, then we can do a deal with you. Now, I think that he must have had, or Russian leadership must have had, some intelligence that that was a possibility. Then again, on the other side, if the Russians knew that, the CIA probably knew that too, and will be watching Zelensky and others who might be tempted to go for that bargain like a hawk, and probably surround them with various radicals from the Nazi units, the Banderists, the fascists, and essentially make it pretty clear to them that if they even looked like they were going to do that, that they and people they cared about would be offed. So Zelensky since then has been appearing with like Bandera fanboy photos in a way that suggests that he's all on board with this. I think, to be honest, he's more of a careerist. He'd happily probably serve the Russian Federation, my guess is, if it came down to it. Would he lead a coup against Zelensky? It's more likely now than it was 18 months ago, given that Zelensky's position has been publicly weakened. He's been publicly humiliated by Biden, and he's reached the point where he's got to be thinking, well, how much longer can I last? Whether Zelensky can do it or what conditions Zelensky is in is anybody's guess, given that his public appearances have been drastically scaled back. So maybe, I mean, it's one possibility. If things start collapsing and the Americans decide that they want to actually get a coup going in Kiev to put somebody else in charge, Zelensky may well be the one that they choose. Budanov, I think, is too crazy and too out there to be considered an option. So it may well be Zelensky is the choice there, but whether they can pull that off or whether if there's a coup, the Ukrainian state just implodes, and whether the Americans even want to put money behind a rump Ukraine is another question. It may be that the Americans just decide that they're going to essentially then use the landmass of Ukraine against the Russians and withdraw slowly from it, burning things as they go, literally burning things down, and leave the Russians having to take over the whole thing. That may well be that what some in the US, like the CIA Director Burns, are considering, because they will have seen the speeches from Putin about the possibilities, of leaving Western Ukraine open. And the Americans won't want, I don't think, the Poles to go for an occupation of Western Ukraine, because then that would put the Poles, and if the Hungarians went for Transcarpathia, it would mean that NATO countries would then be involved in the direct management of the former Ukraine, almost as partners with the Russians, which is part of why the Russians want to leave Western Ukraine alone. It may be that the Americans are thinking, well, why don't we try and force the Russians to have to go all the way to Lvov and all the way up to the Polish border, because that way we can create even more instability in this former Ukraine and create even more chaos and force the Russians to deploy even more resources and drain the Russian Federation that way. Again, think of the most cynical, brutal, and cowardly way a nation can operate, and that's how the American ruling class are going to do something. So Zelensky, yeah, he may lead a coup. Whether he's capable of leading a coup and then leading a surrender to the Russians, that's another question. My guess is that he's got many people sat on him day in, day out, that he's probably one of the most heavily surveilled men in the world, along with the other Ukrainian generals who are suspect. Whether he can break out of that, another question. He may be tempted to become the ruler of Rump Ukraine, but again, I mean, that's got to be a job with a very low survivability rating. So it's possible, but I wouldn't put it as likely at this stage, Jay, to answer your first question. And Jay follows up with another question, which is, what are your thoughts on the SAG-AFTRA strike in the US entertainment industry? Interesting question. This, of course, if you're not aware, SAG is Screen Actors Guild inside the United States, the Guild for Actors, surprisingly enough, and the other union that is on strike, of course, is the writers who are on strike. And the writers have been on strike already because, of course, they've had a dispute with the studios. And the actors are going on strike because one of the contract clauses that the studio wanted to force on Screen Actors Guild is the idea that they are going to basically retain rights to an actor's likeness that can then be computer generated and used in future productions, with or without the actor's consent, which seems like a deliberately provocative move. The causes of this are that the Hollywood studios are in a crisis. They've got to the point where the consolidation and monopolization within the entertainment industry has created a crisis of creativity. You've got like Disney, which is this gigantic fucking behemoth in entertainment terms, a gigantic corporation which owns these enormous franchises, which it essentially runs as theme park rides like Marvel and Star Wars, Lucasfilm, all of which it's running into the ground because monopolization, particularly like in the field of entertainment, doesn't lead to increased creativity. It leads to essentially trying to milk established franchises dry. And also then you've got a deeper problem in the United States, which is that American imperialism is in an advanced stage of decay. American capitalism, internal capitalism inside the United States is rotting. It's not productive. It's losing its place in the hierarchy of the world economies. And as a result of that rot, you get feeding into this, as I explained when talking about how these things feed off each other, when talking about Stalin's work, Anarchism or Socialism, the rot at the base, at the economic base, feeds up into the realm of the superstructure, which is not just politics, but it's also the ideology that it generates, the bourgeois ideology it generates is increasingly rotten, and the culture that it generates, which is of course part of bourgeois ideology, is increasingly rotten as well. So you used to get all kinds of propaganda produced by Hollywood studios in the 50s and 60s, much of which was virulently anti-communist, but at least it was well done. Now it's literally like the laziest garbage you can possibly create is what the studios are interested in. Get a franchise out at a minimal expense. Don't actually employ anybody half decent to work on the script, or don't allow a half decent script to be finished. Don't bother with a story. Just put like component A, B, and C in there and sell it on a streaming service. Get it out. Get the content out as quickly as you can. That's the business model. And of course, this cultural rot, which comes from a decaying capitalism inside the United States, this fairly rotten culture combines with the monopolization in Hollywood to produce not just a terrible product in the end, but also in deteriorating conditions for those that work in it. There's a few actors at the top who still do very well. There's a few big-time writers who still do very well. But most actors and screenwriters aren't living it up. They're not living the old Hollywood life. They're not even doing as well as they would have done 20 to 30 years ago. And of course, the Hollywood studios would be delighted to replace them with an AI, but an AI is only as good as that which is fed into it. And if that which is fed into it by its programmers is the current rotten state of American culture, then it's just going to produce garbage in and garbage out. So in terms of the strike, it's not a surprise given that conditions for most actors and most writers and other creatives will be deteriorating. And if will this lead to a positive outcome? I don't know. I don't think that the companies will want to give up a lot. Bear in mind that their product isn't exactly bringing in the dollars that they would want at the moment. And so I think that what's going to happen is, I hope that the actors and the writers do win. I do back their strike, as I back the strike of anybody who goes up against the employers, as I would even back a strike by cops on the basis that it would be a good opportunity to actually fracture the state forces. I welcome the development of strikes in the entertainment industry because it's an opportunity to politicize in the proper way, in a better way, those who are involved in the entertainment industry and take them away from rad-lib garbage. Maybe that's a vain hope, but at least some of them might wake up to the realities of the situation, in that they're not being fucked over by white supremacy or any of the other rad-lib buzzwords at the moment. It is the monopolies that are fucking them over. And as soon as they realize that and wake up to it, they might get politicized in a better way. So I hope they win. I do support them. Everybody should, regardless of what you feel about the content put out by Hollywood. That is content which is, of course, dictated by the studios and the studio heads and the corporations that own them, and not the writers and the actors who perform in these things. And I never hold workers responsible for the garbage they have to do. I've done plenty of garbage jobs that were in the British state bureaucracy. So again, we should be looking at supporting these things as a chance to advance class struggle, even if it's in a minor way. And bear in mind, as I said, most actors aren't living it up like, let's think, Robert Downey Jr. or any of the big stars who did very well out of the Marvel franchises. They're mostly people who are struggling to get by. So yeah, I back it, and everybody else should as well. So pause for questions. Hello to CJ over in Richmond. It's 6:53 in the morning. Good morning to you, sir. Irish Partisan comments. Slovakia also has eyes on Transcarpathia, as it used to be part of Czechoslovakia in 20 to 39. Regarding Western Ukraine, it does seem that plans are afoot to bait the Russians back into Lvov. Yeah. Bear in mind, to respond to what Irish Partisan says, what Hillary Clinton said. Not recently, but early last year when the special military operation began. At that point, they thought that the Russians were going to overwhelm the Ukrainians and drive all the way to the west. And they actually wanted that. So at the moment, you've got a situation where the Americans are trying to bait the Russians to go all the way to the west and cause problems for them by having to occupy all of Ukraine, including the Banderist strongholds. And the Russians are probably trying to bait the Poles to do a tacit deal with them to move into that place and take it over themselves. Now, who's going to win out? That's the question. Irish Partisan also says, I see Alex from History Legends channel has lampooned the new Napoleon film. It says littered with historical inaccuracies and heavily CGI'd, indication of the rot in Hollywood. I wanted the new Napoleon film to be good because I think Joaquin Phoenix, for all he's a lunatic, is a very good actor. And Ridley Scott was at one point a very good director. What I can see of it, though, is it looks like exactly what Irish Partisan comments about that. It looks like CGI garbage. A lot of it is going to look like CGI garbage. If you want to get a very good Napoleon film, there's several. There's an old silent movie, at least one silent movie. But one of the best ones I saw was, of course, Waterloo, directed by the Soviet director Sergei Bondarchuk from I think like 1969 or 1970, starring Rod Steiger as Napoleon and the late great Christopher Plummer as Wellington. That's impressive because I think that was shot in Yugoslavia in the late 60s with the Yugoslav army as extras. So you've got like a Bondarchuk does these amazing overhead shots of the battlefield of Waterloo, and it's literally like all the people you see there are real extras, often from the Yugoslav army, dressed up in the costumes of the Napoleonic Wars, reenacting precisely the maneuvers of the Battle of Waterloo. It's an incredibly impressive piece of cinematic work, one that you don't see now precisely because of what we've been talking about, which is monopolization in Hollywood, the destruction of creativity that this monopolization brings, and the generalized rot in the culture, leading them to have a massive over-reliance on CGI because it's a cheap alternative to actually employing extras. But of course, they're finding that these things look more and more hollow. Okay, correction from Irish Partisan. It was actually shot in Western Ukraine using thousands of Soviet troops. Even better. So yes, go and watch Waterloo. It's available in full on YouTube. You can just do a quick search for it. So it's very, very good movie. Excellent piece of cinema. It's a cinematic achievement, to say the least. So, moving on to the next question. This comes from JB on Patreon. Any thoughts on the RFK or West presidential candidacies? Do you think they might lead to some progressive change and acknowledgement of US empire? Well, RFK, I mean, that guy, he is essentially chasing after the dream of the Democratic Party of his father, which I think is a fantasy. Now, he makes certain points that I do agree with. His points about the appalling role of the pharmaceutical industry are largely correct. He was right about the role of Fauci. And the problem is, though, that, of course, he wants to come in and try and rescue American capitalism, which you can't do. And he's trying to run this sort of broadly old school liberal campaign, which is getting more support than I think the Democratic Party leaders would want. So he may act as a bit of a disruptor with regard to that, but I don't see it going anywhere positive. The only positive thing that could happen is that people who listen to him then realize that, well, you can't get to anywhere decent. You can't follow up on any of the points that he's making, which are correct, by sticking to American capitalism. Fundamentally, you can't tackle the power of the pharmaceutical industry whilst remaining within the capitalist framework. You would need to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry without compensation, unify it under one company that will be nationally run as part of an integrated planned economy. And that's the only way you overcome the problems posed by the influence of the pharmaceutical industry. At root, it's because it's operating on a basis of for-profit medicine, not for human need. That's the fundamental problem with the pharmaceutical industry that Kennedy does address in passing, but he thinks you can reform it, and of course you can't. Now, West is a bit of a different order of things. I saw his recent appearance on CNN. He's become stronger in terms of his anti-NATO statements. Of course, he still has that thing of the US left, where he's still saying, Putin's an imperialist, that kind of thing. But, I mean, I would agree that it would be more worth engaging with that campaign in terms of going along to any meetings that it has. It may be worth trying to get West on the ballot in certain states, because it would be something that would annoy the Democratic Party hierarchy and would throw a cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak. Of course, him getting a decent vote should be something that communists should work off in terms of bringing supporters of West over to a communist political position. Because as with Kennedy wanting to go back to New Deal liberalism, West fundamentally wants to go back to American social democracy, really. And that's, of course, impossible. I made a comment on Twitter earlier today that all of the various different political tendencies that are in any way critical of the current status quo, or at least those that aren't libertarian, like whether it's Trump or it's Sanders or it's West, they're all harking back to like New Deal era America. They're all just like in Britain, like all of the left wants to go back to social democratic era Britain, welfare capitalist era Britain, which of course is impossible. Like you got that principally through the influence of the Russian Revolution, the weakening of the ruling classes in Western Europe and Britain, and the need of American imperialism to bankroll concessions to the working class. You're not going to get that when capitalism's in a much more decayed and rotting state. There is no Soviet Union anymore. They don't have an immediate fear of revolution. And again, as I said, capitalism's not in a position to deliver those reforms anymore, but everybody keeps wanting to go back to it. So what communists must do is to say to people, yes, you want to get involved in this campaign, be it Cornel West or maybe Kennedy, because you want to go back to a period where there was a more hopeful life was possible for workers in America. Yeah, understandable. But here's why that's not possible under the current system. And it's not going to be possible either. The only thing that American imperialism is going to offer even the American domestic working class is higher rates of exploitation and possible mobilization into a war economy at one stage, which isn't a hopeful future. So, yeah, we need to engage with these campaigns, but we need to be clear about why what people like Kennedy and West want isn't possible. It isn't possible to reform American capitalism anymore. It was only possible to offer those concessions in a very unique period of time between the 1930s and the 1950s. That period went in 1965. Since then, it's been relentless counter-reforms ever since, both in Britain and in the United States. So, hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Welcome to the chat. So, moving to the next question. Couple of questions. This is from Yusevich on Patreon. I have a question on deindustrialization. What are the good primary sources, especially in Marx and Engels? Is David Harvey commentary any good? I am somewhat new to Marxist literature. Just started volume 1. I presume he means of Capital there. Yes, the deindustrialization is, of course, a product of imperialism. It is commented on very well by Lenin in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So read that if you want to understand why the US, Britain, and the European powers are deindustrializing. Read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That will give you a very good starting point. There is a commentary on deindustrialization by Marx in the first chapter of Capital Volume 2, where he deals with this, and I'll summarize it in brief form here. There, Marx states that there is an inherent pressure within capitalism. And bear in mind, he's writing this in the 1860s. The inherent pressure within capitalism does exist to go from the circuit of money to commodity to money. So money is then funds the production of a commodity, and then that is sold for more money. The pressure that Marx says, and Engels develops this point in a footnote, because remember, Engels was the one who put together Capital Volume 2 and Volume 3, that the pressure exists within that system to just go from money, commodity, money, to cut out commodity production entirely and just go from money to money. Because, of course, who wants the expense of actually producing a commodity if you can just move the money around? And that's a pressure that's been inherent in capitalism, and Marx explains that in Volume 2 of Capital from the very beginning. So, but I would recommend starting with Lenin's work on imperialism, as that gives you a clear guide as to why deindustrialization happens in imperialist countries. But bear in mind also its inherent pressure within capitalism that Marx was identifying from the start. As to Harvey's guides on volume 1 and 2, which I've watched all the way through, these are good introductory pieces, and he's good at explaining certain things about the text. What I would say with regard to his online guides, though, is you have to bear in mind Harvey's own politics as well. Now, I would go with the older version of his Guide to Capital Volume 1, the one that was produced around about 2008. You can still find it on YouTube, because he hasn't gone fully into sort of the degeneration of his politics that followed yet. He abandoned, for instance, the Labour theory of value, which his reasons for doing that never made any sense, other than his further degeneration into social democracy. So look at his old Guide to Capital Volume 1 and go through that. Again, bear in mind, though, he's a reformist social democrat who's Marxist influenced. Doesn't mean he's not worth listening to and you can't get something out of his teaching, but always bear in mind the political biases of those who are presenting you with certain pieces of information is all I'll say there. So yes, Harvey worth engaging with. The other thing that's worth checking out is, of course, the old Soviet manual from, I believe it's from the 30s or early 40s on political economy. That's worth reading. So I'll post some of these on the Patreon page so you can see the links to that as well. Irish Partisan says, Waterloo movie from 1970s, best one. I already read that one. HM asks, how is the West going to sell Ukraine's defeat to their populations? Did they make a mistake propagandizing this war so heavily to start with? Well, yes, they did, HM. They made a mistake because, of course, they massively underestimated the strength of the Russian economy and state. So now, well, what they'll do is this is one of the reasons why they want to spin it out. A sudden dramatic collapse would be a political problem for them. But a slow, grinding, horrific defeat that maybe went on for over the course of another year, that would be something that they could get away with. Because what they need to do is they just need to make sure that Ukraine goes down and down and down the news priorities list. Maybe another BBC presenter will have a drugs and sex scandal that they can all get invested in. But what they will try to do is just relegate it as a story to the point where it's fallen out of public consciousness. That's what they will hope. And so when it gets to the point where some final defeat is incurred by the Ukrainian forces, they will hope that it will not register more widely with the population. We have to make sure that it does register more widely with the population by pointing out that they have spent all this blood and treasure, that they have ruined Ukraine. Remember, never get tired of making the point that the Russians would have made a deal with Zelensky in April of last year, and it could all have been over now. We can get into whether it would have been possible to actually sustain that deal on another live stream. But the fact is that the deal was there. The Russians were ready to sign it, and it was blocked by Biden and the US imperialists themselves, who wanted the war to continue. Just as they want to continue it now, but at very minimal cost to themselves. So the cost will be borne entirely by the Ukrainians, and then the knock-on cost will be borne by the Europeans. Irish Partisan says, the Red Army troops who worked on Bondarchuk's Waterloo spent months training 1850 military drill and becoming familiar with Napoleonic era weapons and tactics. Now that's the kind of thing you don't get anymore. That's real commitment to film production. And if you haven't watched the Liberation Quintet, another great series of Soviet films, you can find that on the Mosfilm channel on YouTube. Again, loads of classic Soviet era films on there with full English subtitles that you should be able to understand. HM says Harvey's transatlantic accent is a red flag. It certainly is. CJ says the political economy text is great because it is written for newly literate and organized around different modes of production: pre-capitalist, capitalist, imperialist, and socialist. Yeah, very good text to read. There's also a number of introductory Soviet texts on various issues that I will be posting on the website, the Marx Engels Lenin Institute website. I've posted some on dialectical materialism already. The Soviet academics continued to produce very good introductory works on dialectics up to really the mid-80s. It was only after the Gorbachev period set in that the real rot came and the whole thing started to implode, and the quality of their academic production suffered accordingly. So, question from G. Carroll on Telegram. Transnistria, genuine socialism or Moldovan oligarch money laundering scheme and communist theme park, or something else, but definitely not under the remit of the special military operation. Yeah, I think that what happened in Transnistria, I've not read a huge amount about it, but what seems to have happened is that certain elements of the old Soviet system were retained. Certain Moldovan oligarchs do have interests there, so we can't say it's a question of genuine socialism. But they've retained certain elements of the old command economy system there, and the fact that it continues to this day, and it hasn't just folded back into Moldova or imploded, says that it does have some mass support from the Transnistrians who are there. So whilst not socialism, whilst not, it's not completely just an oligarchic money laundering scheme. It clearly has some support within the working class that is there. It's not an example of socialism, as I said. So whether it will end up getting merged into Russian territory, I think that's a more difficult question. That more relates to what happens to Odessa and other places. And again, this then takes us straight into G. Carroll's next point. And the question reads as follows. I think that there isn't enough pro-Russian support in the city, meaning Odessa, for the Russians to make a move on it. The city isn't what the Russian nationalists dream it is. It has an ugly past, and many of the ugliest elements are quite happy to be there, certainly since the brainwashing post-2014. My view is that Russia would like to use it as a bargaining chip to end the conflict. They would make a move for it, then back off and allow what is left of Ukraine to keep it to avoid the humiliation of losing its entire seacoast. This will prevent Russia effectively having a border with Romania, which may be a good thing. However, such an analysis assumes a sane opponent, which is not the case. So, the Odessa question is, of course, an interesting one and relates to, well, what is the status of Odessa going to be? What is the status of the entirety of Ukraine going to be? Now, we've already been talking about this extensively. But now, Putin's dropped hints about that Odessa being a Russian city. I think G. Carroll's point may be correct, which is that the Russians may, or at least may have until this point, tried to keep various things as a bargaining chip. So leaving Ukraine access to the Black Sea would be a bargaining chip. I mean, you're correct in saying that. But are we now at the point where the masters of this situation, i.e. the real masters, the United States, are even prepared to countenance that? And that's what I was getting at earlier. Is it more in their interest? Is it in the war party's interest, or the consensus that's developed inside the United States political structure to just keep the war going? To make the Russians, if they possibly can, fight for every single scrap of territory, and again, in the vain hope that something comes up internally inside Russia, or in the more realistic hope that they can just drain Russia of men and resources by making them fight for every single scrap of territory and then take their border up to the NATO countries anyway. This may be the ultimate plan. Whether that plan holds together also depends upon whether the Americans can hold their bloc together, whether they can hold Poland, Hungary and Slovakia in check, for instance. Who will be looking at this and thinking, well, if we're going to end up with Russia as a neighbor anyway, wouldn't it be better to get ourselves a buffer zone? So again, the American plan, I think now that is taking shape, is to just make the Russians take the whole place. That you cannot, if you're Burns, the CIA director, who isn't stupid, or any of the others who have a functioning brain inside the American system, so that rules out Biden, you cannot look at the situation and think the Ukrainians are possibly going to win, nor can you look at it and think that you can sustain this war as it is. So we also have, by the way, reliable reports coming out that even a lot of the mercenaries are ducking out and fucking off. And so what is Ukraine going to have in order to sustain this war? So could it be that the Americans then try to, possibly through the figure of Zelensky, say, right, now forget the offensive, just go on the defensive, don't sign a deal with the Russians, force the Russians to continue fighting, and we'll back you up, and you'll just have to carry out sort of active defense of your areas. But again, how long can they sustain that? How long can they sustain the still immense amount of supplies that would be needed by the Ukrainians just to carry out a defense? How long, again, can they retain the hold over the European bloc and stop the Hungarians, the Slovaks, the Poles, or even the Romanians with regard to Bessarabia being tempted to make a move themselves? All interesting questions. I think I'm gonna put it out there. Basically, the question over Odessa, I'll take G. Carroll's word for it for now, because I don't have the necessary information myself or knowledge to comment on the exact balance of forces within Odessa. Certainly, it was the place where a horrible massacre took place in the House of Trade Unions in 2014. Certainly, there will be pro-Russian sentiments there. I would say that the hope of the Americans that they can just bait the Russians into taking over all of Ukraine and then cause them immense damage via insurgencies. It's not a vain hope. They could certainly cause a lot of problems. But I would say also the Russians have a good degree of experience on squashing insurgencies that are backed by the United States and the British. They successfully, in the end, dealt with what was going on in the Caucasus. Admittedly, they had an ally in Kadyrov, senior and junior, in doing that. They may be looking for somebody similar in Ukraine to step forward and help them. Could that be Zaluzny? Maybe. They'll certainly want somebody to front up for them in Ukraine. They won't want to put in place a situation where they have to govern it themselves directly from Moscow. They'll want a system where they can have somebody who's a visible local face. Perhaps this is the role Zaluzny perhaps could play, but I don't know whether he'd be acceptable to the Russians anymore, given he's publicly associated himself with Bandera. Then again, a changed set of circumstances can make everybody reconsider their allegiances. Zaluzny could say that he was forced to do it. If he's prepared to front up for the Russians in Ukraine and essentially run it as a regional governor, who knows? Maybe a semi-independent Ukraine will then be folded into or back into like the CIS. Maybe it will be incorporated as Belarus has been inside a sort of union state formation. All of these things are possible. Or maybe the Russians just choose to run it themselves directly for a certain period of time to stamp out the insurgencies and stamp out the remains of the Banderists and the various CIA and MI6 assets that are floating around. Either way, the desire of the Americans is, quite clearly, to basically make the Russians go all the way. I think that's clear. And again, the game now being played is, well, can the Americans keep their bloc together, or do the Poles find this all too tempting? All questions that will be answered in time. I think, and my speculation is, that they will keep their bloc together. So, and barring a sort of spectacular political collapse inside the United States itself, or economic collapse, both of which, well, the economic collapse is certainly possible, given the economic difficulties all of the Western economies are facing. But if things continue as they are for now, and the Americans continue to be able to hold their bloc together, then the most likely outcome is that they do essentially force the Russians' hand, in that they force the Russians to go all the way to Lvov, because they can do that just by essentially guaranteeing that no peace is ever signed. This leads us back to the question that, well, does the Ukrainian state collapse completely? Do the Russians take measures to try and collapse that Ukrainian state in order that they can then dictate a dividing line? They can get to a certain point in Ukraine, which I think would include Odessa, because I don't think a deal to sign some kind of lasting agreement is going to be possible for the immediate period. I think that they would want to reach a point and then cut that off, and then get some kind of tacit bargain with somebody on the Western side. It'll have to be the United States if they've kept their bloc discipline together. And again, they would have to collapse the Ukrainian state in order to get that. So again, all of this is in the air, but the American preference is clear. Force the Russians to go all the way into the West, then try and inflict heavy casualties and costs upon them. And the Russian agenda is quite clear, which is that I think that they want to take Kiev, ultimately. And probably they may try to bargain over Odessa, but I don't think a deal's going to be on the table there. And then essentially leave old Galicia to be argued over by the Europeans, whether they want it to be rump Ukraine or whether they want it to be New Poland, New Polish Commonwealth, whatever they want to call it. So I think that's what the Russian agenda is. They won't want to go into Western Ukraine. They've openly said that they don't want to. So we can expect them to reach a certain point and try then to drive some kind of bargain home. I think that point is that it runs from just west of Kiev all the way down to Odessa, and then we look at the re-establishment of the border as it was in August 1914, which is that all these areas are now considered Russian and governed one way or another with direct ties to Moscow. So, okay, that takes us to the end of the questions that have come in so far. I've been going an hour and a half now, so unless there are any further points, I'm going to draw the stream to a conclusion there. I think it's been a good Q&A session. The audio for this will be going up on Patreon later today. But unless there's anything else that anybody wants to add, I'm going to move to a conclusion here. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Oh, Ben Kavanagh, hello. Wherever stage 1 of Ukraine war ends, US imperialism can't stop drive to war. If EU military can't compete, surely we'll have a political economic shift to fix that. Where will troops for stage 2 come from? Well, stage 2 is not going to be possible for a little while, to answer Ben's point. To do the shift that they need to do, there'll need to be fundamental political changes within not just the United States, but all of the European countries, and also fundamental changes as to how the economy is organized. It's why this phase 1 is going to come to a conclusion with Ukraine destroyed and dismembered. They can't, Ben's right, which is they can't get around the need for a war to try and destroy Russia or China or both, but they can't have Europe in the way that it is and expect that to win. They would need to go to war economies, and that would require a move to a more openly or rabidly authoritarian and Bonapartist, at least, methods of rule inside Europe and the United States in order to essentially force the economy in the direction of reindustrialization. Because they can't, one of the reasons they can't sustain this war at the moment is that Europe and the United States is too deindustrialized. They're now all talking about reindustrialization, but they would essentially then need to clamp down in one way or another on financial capitalism, on finance capitalism, and force reinvestment in reindustrialization. Yes, this would also come with a probably destruction or an attempted destruction of working class bargaining power, a destruction of independent trade union organization and any opposition political parties, most likely on the ground. They would call it national renewal, but they would have to, as even the Nazis and the fascists had to in the 30s and 40s, create some kind of state-directed economy in order to reindustrialize to the point where they could hope to sustain a war against the Russians or the Chinese, because at the moment they've got no hope of doing either, which is why they're opting for the most cowardly options possible. So without fundamental changes in bourgeois politics inside the NATO bloc, they can't reindustrialize successfully, and they can't sustain a direct military challenge to Russia or China. So we can look to see, and we can already see the shapes of this coming. In America and in Western Europe and Britain, that more reactionary trends will emerge that contain elements of populism that are prepared to go down the route of defending civilization, so to speak, by setting up a more openly fascistic system. That the principal target of which, first of all, will be the domestic working class, and then to drill the domestic working class in a militaristic fashion to recreate certain industries inside these countries, which can then opt to act as the drivers for remilitarization. But all of that's got to happen first, and what's also got to happen is, of course, that there will be significant opportunities to counteract that through class struggle that do come up, because they are going to go hell for leather to destroy working class bargaining power first. They will have to do that to render the operations profitable. So these all present, problems, but also, on the other hand, significant opportunities for communists to make advances within the working class when the ruling class drop the mask and go for just open repression and more fascistic methods inside these countries. So that will be my answer to Ben's point there. I'm happy to expand on that in future programs as well. But I will leave it there. It is now 12:34 in Britain. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in and contributed today. So Peter, Jerry, Irish Partisan, Terry, Roddy, Gillian, and hello to Warren and Michelle in Tasmania, to Paddy, Jay, to Steve Sweeney, to CJ over in Norfolk, Virginia, to Roddy, to HM, to Ben, to everybody else who's been watching and watching silently. Thank you for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.